She was not supposed to be there at all. That was the first thing anyone would have told you, if you had thought to ask. The garden party at Ashbourne Park was for the eligible daughters of good families, the ones whose names appeared on lists kept by matchmaking mothers, the ones whose faces launched careful campaigns every season. It was not for Clara Holt, the quiet older daughter of a Gloucestershire vicar, a woman of 27 who had been told so many times that her best years were behind her that she had almost stopped remembering a time when anyone had suggested otherwise. But Clara was there, standing just inside the iron gate that separated the formal gardens from the kitchen path, watching her younger sister Cecily float across the lawn like something conjured from a dream. Cecily was 22 and radiant, white with golden hair that caught the afternoon sun and a laugh that made every head turn in its direction. 3 gentlemen were already competing for the honor of carrying her parasol. 2 more hovered at the periphery, waiting for their moment. Clara watched from the shade and felt absolutely nothing about it, which she supposed meant she had finally made her peace with the way things were. Or perhaps she simply felt nothing because she was watching, with far more interest, the man pruning roses at the far end of the garden wall. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. He had been there since before the guests arrived. Clara had noticed him on her way in, when Cecily had been adjusting her bonnet ribbons and their mother had been scanning the crowd for titled men, and Clara, as usual, had been looking at everything else. He had been half hidden by the climbing roses then, working with quiet, methodical concentration, and something in the steadiness of him had caught her eye. Now, nearly an hour later, he was still there, still working, in a linen shirt damp at the collar and rolled to the elbows, and the line of his back was rigid with the particular tension of someone who had been too long in an uncomfortable position and refused to acknowledge it. Clara had seen that look before. She had worn it herself at every dinner party and drawing-room assembly where she was expected to be grateful for her invitation and the small in her occupation of space. She glanced around at the party, where no one was looking for her, because no one was ever looking for her. And then she walked toward the man at the rose wall. She had not always been invisible. There had been a time, before Cecily had grown into a remarkable beauty, before the modest living of a country vicar had become synonymous with the word inadequate in every conversation conducted within her mother's hearing, when Clara had been considered perfectly acceptable. She had good posture. She had read widely and could speak on the subjects she'd read with enough intelligence to hold a conversation. Her needlework was competent, her pianoforte playing passable, and her watercolors occasionally quite good in the opinion of people who did not have much basis for comparison. The problem was that none of these qualities were visible from across a ballroom. They could not be assessed in the 30 seconds it took a gentleman to scan a room and determine which women were worth pursuing. Clara's face was pleasant rather than striking, her figure neat but unremarkable, and her manner, which her father had called forthright and her mother called unfortunate, had a habit of bypassing the soft edges of polite performance entirely. Her mother had long since stopped pretending that this was anything other than a problem. "You might smile more," Mrs. Holt had been saying for the better part of 15 years, in various formulations and with varying degrees of desperation. "You might let a gentleman speak without correcting him. You might not tell Lord Whitmore that his agricultural theory was disproven 30 years ago, even if it was, Clara, even if it absolutely was." Clara smiled now, be small and private, at the memory of Lord Whitmore's face. She had not been invited back to his estate, but she had not particularly wanted to go back, so she considered that chapter closed. The truth was simpler and more honest than any of her mother's diagnoses. Clara had been taught, by books and by the quiet example of her father's vicarage, that people were worth the same attention regardless of their station. She had never been able to perform the selective blindness that society required, the practiced art of seeing some people clearly and letting others blur into the background. It made her uncomfortable in assemblies. It made her, according to her mother, unmarriageable. It had also, though neither of them spoke of it, driven Cecily's prospects to become the family's single-minded focus. That was why they were at Ashbourne Park today, at a garden party to which they had been invited by Lady Pemberton out of distant connection and the social obligation of filling out the numbers. Cecily was the reason they had come. Cecily, who glittered and who attracted, and who had this year finally drawn the serious attention of a gentleman of means, if not yet of title. Their mother moved through the garden party like a general overseeing a campaign, ensuring Cecily was well-positioned, well-lit, and well-attended. Clara had been told in the carriage on the way over that she was not to do anything today that reflected poorly on her sister's chances. She was, in other words, to make herself as small and unremarkable as possible. This she had done for approximately 40 minutes, but before the sight of a man working without rest in the afternoon heat became something she could no longer ignore. The Duke of Ravensmoor had been a groundskeeper for 11 days. Not truly, of course. He remained what he had always been, Sebastian Vane, the 8th holder of one of England's oldest titles, owner of 3 estates in 2 counties, possessor of an income that made even wealthy men go quiet with calculation when they thought no one was listening. He was 32 and unmarried, and the despair, his grandmother liked to remind him, of everyone who had ever hoped for continuance of the Vane line. But for 11 days, beginning with the country house party at Longwood in Kent, and continuing now at Ashbourne Park in Gloucestershire, Sebastian had dressed in borrowed clothes and worked in borrowed gardens and watched the women his grandmother had assembled for his consideration from a vantage point none of them suspected. It had been his sister Dorothea's idea, in the abstract, though she would strenuously deny having intended the specific execution. "You want to know who people are when they're not performing," she had said over supper 6 weeks ago, when their grandmother had spent the better part of the meal listing the eligible daughters of suitable families, in a tone that suggested the fate of civilization depended on Sebastian's marriage by Christmas. Then, stop looking at them when they're performing. He had lain awake for 3 nights turning that sentence over, and until its implications had crystallized into a plan his valet thought was eccentric, and his steward found alarming, and his grandmother did not know about it all. The plan was simple. He would attend these gatherings not as himself, but as nobody. As a groundsman, borrowed from the estate staff, plausible in rough clothes and unremarkable enough to be looked past. He would watch how these women behaved when they believed no one of consequence was watching, how they spoke to the servants who filled their glasses, how they stepped around those they considered beneath them, how they treated the invisible people who kept the world running and received no gratitude for it. At Longwood, his results had been depressing. Lady Frances Ashton had twice ordered him to move when he was working in her eyeline, or using the particular tone reserved for obstacles and inconveniences. Miss Georgiana Pelham had not spoken to him at all, had looked through him as though he were made of glass every time he had come within 10 feet of her. And Lady Catherine Marlowe, who his grandmother considered the finest prospect of the current season, had dropped her gloves near where he was raking gravel and waited with visible impatience for him to retrieve them, before turning away without a word of acknowledgement, much less thanks. Sebastian had come away from Longwood with a list of very accomplished women, all of them beautiful, none of them, in his considered opinion, particularly kind. He had not expected Ashbourne Park to be different. He had come out of obligation because his grandmother had made the arrangements, and the Pembertons were old friends, and because 11 more days of watching from the margins cost him nothing but dignity, which he was finding he minded less and less the longer this particular experiment went on. He had not expected her. She came toward him along the garden path with the directness of someone who had made up her mind and saw no reason to slow down about it. She was not like the others, who moved in practiced arcs and occupied their space with conscious elegance. She walked the way a person walks when they are thinking about where they are going rather than how they look while getting there, which in Sebastian's experience was a rarer quality than it should have been. She was not the sort of woman who would have appeared on his grandmother's list. He could see that immediately and with certainty. The list required beauty of a particular, the fashionable variety, and this woman was something else entirely. Her dress was clean and well kept, but plainly made, her dark hair pinned without ornament, her face more interesting than lovely, the kind of face that repaid attention without immediately demanding it. But her eyes, when they met his across the distance between them, were extraordinary, clear and brown and direct, the color of deep water over autumn leaves, and looking at him with the frank, uncalculating gaze of someone who saw a person and had not yet bothered to calculate what kind. Sebastian made himself return to the rosebush. He was meant to be pruning it. He should not be staring. "You've been at this since before we arrived," she said. He looked up again. She had stopped 4 feet away, with a tin cup held toward him, condensation purling on the metal. She must have detoured to the refreshment table on her way. His hands went still on the shears. "The heat is considerable," she continued when he didn't speak, and something in her voice carried a dry, careful observation, as though she found the afternoon's weather mildly insufficient. "I noticed you hadn't stopped." Sebastian accepted the cup. Their fingers did not quite touch, but they almost did, and he was acutely aware of the inch of warm summer air between them. The water was cool and tasted of lemon, and he drank it without looking away from her face. "That's very kind, miss." It seemed like the obvious thing to do. She tilted her head slightly, glancing toward the garden party over her shoulder. "Though I notice the obvious thing frequently goes undone." He followed her gaze and saw 3 ladies watching with the bright, empty attention of people who had found something to discuss and were saving it for later. Not watching out of concern, not watching because they had had the same impulse she had and wondered who had acted on it first. Watching because a woman of their acquaintance was speaking to a groundskeeper, and this, apparently, was the most interesting thing that had happened all afternoon. "You may catch a reputation for eccentricity," Sebastian said, and then regretted it, because it was too observed, too personal, not the kind of thing a groundskeeper said to a guest. But she only smiled. It was a small smile, contained in one corner of her mouth, and it made her face do something he hadn't expected. "I have that reputation already," she said. "I find it saves considerable effort." Sebastian handed back the cup, which she took without fuss. "How so?" "Once people have decided you're odd, they stop watching quite so carefully. You can be honest, which is a relief." She looked at him with that level gaze. "I expect that's something you understand." He went very still. She couldn't know. There was no way she could know. He looked the part entirely. He had been assured of this by his man and by the Ashbourne head groundskeeper, who had accepted the arrangement with the philosophical pragmatism of a man who had seen stranger things in the employ of the aristocracy. "Everyone is watched when they do their work," he said carefully, "not the way guests are watched." She glanced again at the 3 ladies who had made a show of resuming their own conversation. "Guests are watched and judged and found wanting or sufficient in the span of an afternoon. It seems exhausting." A pause. Though I suppose work is exhausting in its own way." "It is," Sebastian said honestly, "though I find it preferable to some alternatives." She considered this. He had the odd sensation of being actually considered, not assessed, not measured against some invisible standard of usefulness, but genuinely thought about, as though his words deserved engagement. "Clara," she said at last. "Clara Holt. My father is the vicar at Colford. My sister is the one over there with the parasol and all the gentlemen." She said it without bitterness, which was the extraordinary thing. He had heard women speak of sisters with bitterness and resignation and careful, polished indifference. This was none of those. It was simply a fact she offered him, the same way she had offered the cup of water, without calculation, without performance. You don't resent it," Sebastian said, before he could stop himself. "Cecily is genuinely lovely," Clara said. "It would be irrational to resent her for it. I might resent the assumption that loveliness is the only thing worth noticing about a person, but that is rather a larger argument than one afternoon can accommodate." The corner of her mouth moved again. "I'm told I have these large arguments too often." "Told by whom?" "My mother, primarily. Most of society, secondarily." She looked at the roses he had been working on, the spent blooms he had cut back. "You've done well with those. They'll come again stronger next month." He looked at the roses and thought absurdly that she was right. "You know about roses?" "My father's garden. I spent most of my childhood in it rather than learning more socially useful things." She took a step back, the slight retreat of someone who has talked longer than she intended and is becoming aware of it. I should go back. My mother will wonder where I've wandered to. Miss Holt, Sebastian said. She turned. He had no reason to ask her to stay. He was a groundskeeper. She was a guest. Everything about their positions, real and performed, made this conversation already the outer limit of the permissible. And yet he found himself absolutely unwilling to let her walk back into the party and disappear into the background she had been sentenced to occupy. "Thank you," he said, "for the water." "It seemed like the obvious thing," she said again, and smiled again, and walked back toward the party. Sebastian watched her go, or he watched her sister notice her return and pull her close to whisper something. He watched Clara's expression hold its composed steadiness, absorbing whatever was said, not defending, not apologizing. He watched three gentlemen not look at her at all. He looked at the cup still in his hand, which she had forgotten. There was a small ink stain on the inner rim, transferred from her fingers. He had been watching these gatherings for 11 days. He had been looking for something he could not quite name, something his grandmother's lists could never provide, something that had been absent from every ballroom and drawing room and carefully arranged dinner party he had attended in the previous 2 seasons. He had been watching with the exhausted certainty that whatever it was, he would not find it here. He had been wrong. The difficulty, Sebastian reflected, setting down the empty cup and picking up his shears, was that he had told her his name was Thomas. He had not meant to lie. He had simply not said his real name fast enough, and then she had offered hers with such easy directness that he had said the first name that came to him, his father's name, the name no one called him by, a lie that was also a kind of tribute and also, undeniably, a lie. She had given him honesty from the very first word. She had brought him water and told him her father was a vicar and confessed her reputation for eccentricity and described her sister without bitterness. She had given him the plain, simple truth of herself in the way she apparently gave everyone the plain, simple truth, and he had given her a fiction. He was going to have to fix this. The question was how. The evening air cooled as the garden party wound toward its close. Carriages began to arrive on the gravel drive, and the ladies gathered their wraps and their conversations. Sebastian moved closer to the main path, under the pretense of gathering his tools, and watched Clara Holt prepare to leave. She was the last to reach the carriage. Her mother had gone ahead with Cecily, who was laughing at something one of her admirers had said, her golden head tipped back with the particular abandon of a woman who knows she is being watched and enjoys it. Clara came last, unhurried, her bonnet ribbons still loosely tied from some time in the afternoon wind. She paused at the gate, and he thought she might look back. She did. Not toward the party, not toward the garden as a whole, but directly at the corner where he had been working all afternoon. And the roses, long past their best for the day, stood in their tidy rows. She did not see him. He was already in the shadow of the elm, tools in hand, watching. She looked at the roses for a moment, something in her face quiet and considering. Then she turned and went through the gate, and the sound of wheels on gravel carried her name away with it. Sebastian stood in the cooling garden for a long time after the last carriage had gone. The party servants were clearing the refreshment tables. The evening star was appearing above the east wing of the great house. Somewhere inside, Lord and Lady Pemberton were already dressing for dinner, a dinner to which Sebastian Vane, Duke of Ravensmoor, was expected, freshly washed and correctly attired and ready to perform. He looked at the cup he had forgotten he was still carrying. She looked at the ink stain on its rim. He had come to Ashbourne Park to find an honest woman. He had found her in the first hour. She was the daughter of a country vicar who had been told all her life that she was too much and not enough in equal measure. And she had brought water to a stranger in the heat without wanting anything for it. And she had smiled at him with a quality of seeing that he had almost forgotten was possible. The problem was that she thought his name was Thomas. Tomorrow, he decided. He would find a way to fix it tomorrow, before the line grew too large to walk back through. He carried the cup inside and went to dress for dinner, and thought about a woman with ink on her fingers and clear brown eyes, and told himself, as he tied his cravat in the glass, that this was something he could make right, when he was not yet certain it was true. He found her the next morning in the Ashbourne Park Library. He had not been looking for her precisely. He had been avoiding the breakfast room, where his grandmother's most recent letter had been read twice and set face down on the writing desk, its contents still ringing in his ears. She had heard, somehow, about his absence from the Longwood dinner. She had questions. She had always had questions, delivered in the particular tone of a woman who already knew the answers and wanted only to see how well you would lie to her face. Sebastian had no stomach for it before noon, so he had come to the library, because he always came to libraries when the world became too loud, and he had pushed open the door, expecting empty chairs and dusty silence. He found instead Clara Holt, standing on the second rung of the rolling ladder, her neck craned upward, one hand braced on the shelf and the other reaching for a volume that was precisely 3 inches above her reach. He said nothing. She had not heard the door. She stretched further, her boot slipping slightly on the rung, and made a small sound of intense concentration that under any other circumstances he would have found entirely unremarkable. Under these circumstances, it made something in his chest perform an action it had no business performing. "The blue one," Sebastian said, because he could see the spine she was after from where he stood. "Third from the left." Clara startled. Her hand caught the shelf, and she did not fall. But it was a near thing, and when she looked down at him, her expression passed rapidly through surprise, a recognition, and something he could not quite name before settling into its usual composed steadiness. "Thomas," she said. The name landed between them with the quiet weight of a thing that had already begun to matter. "Good morning, Miss Holt." He crossed the room and reached past her without ceremony, extracting the volume she had been after. She descended the ladder with more dignity than the situation required, and he handed her the book. Their fingers met on the cover. Neither of them moved immediately. "Montaigne," he said, reading the spine. "My father quotes him constantly." She did not look away from his face. "I thought it was time I found out whether he deserved it." "Does he? I've only just started." She looked down at the book and then back up. I wouldn't have thought a groundskeeper would recognize Montaigne on sight." Sebastian felt it then, the specific cold discomfort of a lie that is becoming too large to maintain. "My employer had a well-stocked library," he said, which was true as far as it went. Ravensmoor House had 4,000 volumes and a librarian on permanent staff. She looked at him in that particular way she had, that considering, unhurried assessment that seemed to cost her nothing and extracted rather a great deal from the person being considered. Sebastian had been examined by diplomats and interrogated by parliamentary committees and inspected by his grandmother on a weekly basis for 32 years. He had never felt as seen as he did under the quiet gaze of a vicar's daughter with ink on her fingers. "Sit," she said, "if you have a moment." He had a great many moments. He was, after all, supposed to be resting between garden tasks. "Just briefly." They sat in the 2 chairs by the east window, where morning light came in at a low angle and lay in gold bars across the carpet. Outside, the formal gardens were still and dew-bright. The rest of the house party would not be down for another hour. Sebastian was acutely aware that no one knew he was here, and that no one, if they did know, would consider this appropriate, and that he could not make himself care about either of those things. "Your sister," he said. "Is she enjoying the party?" "Enormously." Clara opened the Montaigne to the first page, but did not read it. "3 gentlemen paid calls this morning before 9 o'clock. My mother is beside herself with satisfaction." A pause. "They are perfectly pleasant men, all 3. Cecily will be well taken care of." "And you?" She looked up. "I beg your pardon?" "Will you be well taken care of?" The question seemed to surprise her, which surprised him, because it seemed the obvious next thing to ask. "I take care of myself," she said at last. "I always have, more or less. I teach the younger village children when the schoolmaster is unwell. I help my father with his correspondence. I manage what needs managing." She turned a page she had not read. "I'm quite useful, in small ways." "That is not what I asked." Clara was quiet for a moment. Outside, a thrush began to sing in the hornbeam hedge, its notes clear and unhurried in the morning air. "No," she said. "I suppose it isn't." She looked out the window. "I had a situation once that I thought might become something." A curate, a friend of my father's. We understood each other well, or I believed we did. He married someone else in the end, someone with a better dowry and a quieter disposition." She said it with the same quality of plain honesty with which she said everything. "My mother said it was my own fault for being so decided in my opinions. My father said the man was a fool. I thought they were probably both a little right." Sebastian looked at her profile against the morning light and felt something he had not expected to feel, which was anger. Not the performed outrage of a man looking for something to object to, but the genuine, quiet anger of someone who has seen a real injustice and cannot unknow it. This woman, with her directness and her Montaigne and her water offered to strangers in the heat, she had been told too many times by too many people that there was something wrong with her that needed correcting. "Your father was more right," he said. She turned to look at him. Something in his tone had given him away. He could feel it, the control slipping slightly, the groundskeeper's careful blankness replaced for just a moment by something that did not belong to a man in a borrowed shirt. "You are not quite what you appear," she said slowly. He held her gaze. "No." "Are you going to tell me what you are?" "Not yet." The truth of it surprised him even as he said it. "I will. I promise you I will. But I would like, if you'll allow it, a little more time to be nobody." Clara studied him with those clear eyes. The thrush was still singing. The gold light was moving across the carpet as the sun climbed. "That's a very odd thing to say," she said finally. "I know. And I should probably be alarmed." "Probably." She was quiet for another moment. Then she opened her book properly and settled back in her chair with the air of someone who has made a decision and intends to stick to it. "Well," she said, "I suppose everyone deserves to be nobody for a little while. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one." They met in the library 3 more times over the following 4 days, always in the early morning, always before the rest of the house was properly awake. On the second morning, she brought 2 cups of tea from the kitchen. Dee fetched herself because she had not wanted to ask a servant to carry them across the house for no reason she could explain. On the third, she brought the Montaigne back and left it on the table between them, open to a passage she had marked with a strip of paper. He read it while she looked out the window at the rain. "If you press me to say why I loved him, I can say no more than because he was him, and I was I." He did not comment on the passage, neither did she. The marked page sat between them like a question neither of them was ready to answer. On the 4th morning, she did not come, and the absence of her was a physical thing, a weight in the room, a wrongness in the quality of the light. He found her later, on the lower terrace, standing at the stone balustrade with her hands folded and her eyes on the middle distance. She heard him approach and did not turn immediately, which meant she had known who it was from his footstep. He stood beside her. Below the terrace, the garden rolled down toward a ha-ha, and beyond it, meadows and then woodland, and then the long blue line of the hills. "My mother has had a letter from home," Clara said. "The Pemberton visit ends in 3 days. We return to Colford." A pause. "Cecily has received an offer, an informal one from Mr. Hartwell. She's very pleased. My mother is even more pleased. My father is writing a sermon about gratitude." "And you?" He had begun to ask this too often. He could not seem to stop. "I am happy for Cecily." She turned to look at him, and he saw something new in her face, something that had not been there in the library. Not sadness, exactly. Something older and quieter. "I am going home to Colford, where I will teach the vicar's pupils and manage the correspondence and be useful in small ways, and that will be my life. And it is not a bad life." She looked at him steadily. "And I will not see you again." The words fell between them with the weight of everything that had not been said. "Clara." Her name and his voice stopped her cold. Not Miss Holt, but Clara, and she heard the difference. She heard the Duke in it, the man beneath the fiction, the thing he had been holding back and could no longer hold. "Tell me," she said quietly. "Whatever it is, tell me now." He had planned to do this differently. He had thought there would be a proper moment, a structured confession, a context in which the truth would land gently rather than like a stone dropped from a great height. Standing on the terrace with 3 days left and the hills going blue in the afternoon haze, there was no proper moment available, only this one. "My name is not Thomas," he said. "My name is Sebastian Vane. I am the Duke of Ravensmoor." Silence. Clara did not move. She held the edge of the balustrade with both hands and looked at him with an expression that passed through disbelief, recalibration, and something that might have been the first stirring of anger. "You have been employed as a groundskeeper," she said with extraordinary precision. "I have been disguising myself as one, for 11 days, across 2 house parties." He made himself hold her gaze. "I wanted to see how the women on my grandmother's lists behaved when they thought no one of importance was watching. And how did they behave? Badly in the main." Another silence. Longer this time. A rook called somewhere in the elms. The afternoon light shifted. "You were testing them," Clara said. "Yes. And you were testing me." "No." The distinction mattered enormously to him. "You were not on any list. You were not part of any plan. You simply came toward me with a tin cup and told me I looked overheated, and everything after that has been entirely outside of my plans." "You lied to me." Her voice was very even. "From the very first exchange. I gave you my name and you gave me a fiction. My father's name. I used my father's name. He did not know why he offered that. It changed nothing. I was not ready to be myself yet, and you startled me, and I said the wrong thing. And then it was said, and I could not take it back. You could have corrected it at any point in the following 4 days. I know. You chose not to." "I chose to be selfish," Sebastian said. "I wanted a little more time when someone spoke to me as though I were simply a person. I knew it was wrong. I am not asking you to forgive me for that. I am telling you the truth now, because you are leaving in 3 days and I could not let you go without it." Clara turned back to the view. Her hands were still on the balustrade, white-knuckled now. He could see the effort of composure in the line of her jaw, the controlled stillness of someone refusing to let what they feel show on the outside until they have decided how they feel. He had caused that. The knowledge of it was deeply uncomfortable. "What do you want from me?" she asked at last. "No, you have made your confession. You have been honest, belatedly. What do you want?" He could have been careful here. He could have retreated to safe ground, expressed only apology, offered no more than he could reasonably justify. He had been careful for 2 seasons, and it had gotten him nothing but loneliness. "I want to come to Colford," he said, "as myself. I want to call on your father properly and ask his permission to court you, and I want to know whether what has happened between us this week is something you might allow to continue." Clara was quiet for a long time. "You are a duke," she said. "Yes." "I am a vicar's daughter with no dowry and no connections, and a reputation for arguing with perfectly powerful men about their outdated agricultural theories." Despite everything, Sebastian felt the corner of his mouth move. "I know. Your grandmother will be appalled. Almost certainly. Society will say I trapped you, that I deceived my way into your regard through some elaborate scheme." She looked at him, and something in her face had shifted, some of the rigidity easing into something more complicated and less comfortable. "You see the problem with a man in disguise offering his heart to a woman who didn't know who he was. It makes her position impossible." "I see it," Sebastian said, "and I have thought of nothing else since Monday. I have no argument against it except that what I feel is real, and I believe, though I may be wrong, that what you have felt in that library is real also. The tea you brought without being asked, the passage you marked." He looked at her steadily, "because he was him and I was I." She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, they were very bright. "That was not meant for you to read." "No, I know." He took a breath. "I'm sorry, Clara, for the lie and for the position it puts you in, and for the fact that the apology is insufficient. But I'm not sorry for the weak. I'm not sorry for knowing you." The rook called again. The hills were going darker now as clouds moved in from the west. In the house behind them, a clock was chiming 4, and somewhere inside, Sebastian could hear voices gathering, the party beginning its evening routines. Clara stepped back from the balustrade. Her expression was composed again, but there was something new beneath the composure, something raw that had not been there before. "Go inside," she said quietly. "Go be your grace the Duke, whatever the evening requires of you. And I will think about what you have said." She paused. "I do not know what I will think about it. I want you to understand that. I am not telling you yes. I know, but I am not telling you no." She looked at him steadily one more time with those extraordinary eyes, seeing him, all of him, the Duke and the man and the fiction and the truth. And he bore her looking with everything he had. "Good evening, Thomas," she said, and there was something in the name that was both a reproach and almost a kindness. She went inside. Sebastian stood on the terrace while the evening closed in around him and tried to decide if he had just ruined the only real thing he had found in 2 years of looking. The next morning she did not come to the library. He waited for an hour, which was the longest he could justify before the head groundskeeper needed him to give some account of his whereabouts. The chairs sat empty. The gold light moved across the carpet without her in it. He left the Montaigne on the table in case she came later and left himself no note to leave beside it. She did not come in the afternoon either. He saw her once at a distance, walking with her sister along the kitchen garden wall, Cecily talking rapidly and Clara listening with the particular attention she brought to everything, and once more at the evening's card party, seated beside her mother with a book open in her lap that she was not reading. He should not have looked at her so long. He was aware of that. What he was not aware of, until it was too late to prevent it, was that Lady Grantham had been watching him look. Lady Grantham was 53 and well-connected, and had come to Ashbourne Park for the garden party and stayed for the gossip, which she collected with the same industrious pleasure with which other women collected porcelain or pressed flowers. She had sharp eyes and sharper ears, and she had been observing the Duke of Ravensmoor's unusual activities for the past 4 days with growing fascination. She cornered Clara's mother the following morning before breakfast. Sebastian did not know this. He was in the stables, ostensibly to check on a lame horse, actually because he needed something to do with his hands while he thought about what came next. He heard nothing until Dorothea, his sister, arrived in a hired carriage at 9:30, with the expression of someone who has ridden overnight and arrived at a disaster site. Sebastian," she said, pulling him aside from the groom who had come to take her horse. "I had a letter from Lady Grantham. She wrote to me directly, which should tell you everything about the state of things." She pressed the letter into his hands. "She has told Mrs. Holt everything, the disguise, the testing, all of it. She has made it sound, Sebastian, as though you conducted an elaborate deception specifically to prey upon a naive country girl who had no idea she was being manipulated." Sebastian read the letter. His jaw tightened. "She has also implied," Dorothea continued more quietly, "that your interest in Miss Holt is not honorable, that you identified a woman of no consequence who could be courted without risk of expectation. That is completely false. I know, but Mrs. Holt doesn't know that. She received this letter an hour ago." Dorothea looked at him steadily. "They have already called for the carriage, Sebastian. They are leaving today, not in 3 days, this morning." The news hit him like a door opened against him. "Clara," he said, "is by all accounts not speaking to her mother or to anyone else, and is sitting in the front parlor with her bonnet on and her bag packed, which I think tells you what kind of a night she has had." His sister's voice was careful now, precise as a surgeon's. "Whatever you were planning to do, you have perhaps an hour." He was already moving. Clara heard the door of the parlor open and did not look up. She had decided, in the long, dark hours of the previous night, that she would not cry in front of her mother, would not argue with the letter's characterization of events, and would not hope. Now hoping required a version of events in which she was not precisely what Lady Grantham had implied, a naive woman from the country who had been charmed by a man in a borrowed shirt and had given him more of her inner life in 4 mornings than she had given anyone in 7 years. Hoping required a version of events in which that had been real. She had the Montaigne in her bag. She had taken it from the library last night, not as theft, she told herself, but as evidence. Evidence that something had happened. Evidence that she had been seen, truly, for a little while. Miss Holt, Not the groundskeeper's voice this time, not Thomas. This was another voice carrying the same timbre, but with the full weight of consequence behind it. The voice of a man who was accustomed to being listened to, and was, in this moment, clearly uncertain whether he deserved to be. Clara stood. He was in proper clothes. She had not seen him like this before, and the fact of it was strange because he was recognizably himself, the same face, the same eyes, but surrounded now by all the paraphernalia of what he was, the good coat, the pristine linen, the ring on his right hand that she understood now was not simply a ring but a declaration of centuries. Behind him, in the doorway, his sister hovered with the expression of someone who has done what they can and is leaving the rest to Providence. "I have approximately 5 minutes," Clara said, "before my mother comes to collect me." "I know." Sebastian crossed the room and stopped 3 feet from her. At this distance, with nothing borrowed about him, he was very much a duke, except for his eyes, which were the same. Lady Grantham has told your mother a version of events designed to cause maximum damage to your reputation and my character in one efficient operation." "Has she lied?" "She has told the truth as it would appear to someone who wished it to appear badly." He held her gaze. "The disguise was real. The intention to test was real. And what I told you on the terrace was equally real and is not diminished because it arrived in the company of a lie." Clara looked at him. She thought about the mornings in the library. She thought about the passage in the Montaigne that she had marked and left between them like a confession she had not intended to make. She thought about the way he had said her name on the terrace, without the title, just her name, and the way it had felt like being recognized after a very long time of being invisible. "Your grandmother will say, 'I am after your title,'" she said, "very likely. My mother will say you are not serious and that I have made a fool of myself. Probably. And I will go back to Colford and become the subject of every letter Lady Grantham writes for the next 6 months. Unless," Sebastian said carefully, "you give me the chance to show them all that I am entirely serious. Unless you let me come to Colford, properly, with my real name and my real intentions, and give me the opportunity to be the man who deserves the person you have been in those mornings." Clara's hands were clasped in front of her, still and steady, though the steadiness cost her something. "And if I do," she said quietly, "and your grandmother forbids it, and society laughs and the whole enterprise comes apart as it very reasonably might, then I am simply the woman who thought a duke was serious about her and was wrong. You are also the woman who was right, and who chose to be brave, and who found something real." Sebastian reached into his coat pocket and produced the tin cup. She recognized it immediately. The one she had carried to him that first afternoon, the one with the ink stain from her fingers. "I have been carrying this," he said, "since the garden party, because it is the only honest thing that has passed between us, and I needed something to remind me what honesty felt like." He placed it on the table beside her, gently, as though it were made of something valuable. "Come back to Colford, Clara. Let me come find you there. And if, when I come as myself, in full daylight with nothing concealed, yet you decide that the lie was too large to forgive and the gap between our worlds too wide to cross, I will accept that. I will accept whatever you decide. But please," and his voice broke just slightly on the word, not enough for anyone else to hear, barely enough for her, "let me have the chance to deserve you." From the hallway, her mother's voice carried clearly, calling Clara's name, announcing that the carriage was waiting. Clara looked at the cup on the table. She looked at the man in front of her. She thought about Colford and the schoolroom, and the small, useful life that waited for her, and how it had felt, for 4 mornings, to be known. She picked up the cup and put it in her bag, next to the Montaigne. Then she walked to the parlor door, and paused with her hand on the frame, and did not turn around when she spoke, because she did not trust her face. "My father receives callers on Tuesday and Thursday morning," she said, "between 10 and noon." She did not wait to hear his response. She walked out into the hall where her mother was waiting with barely contained agitation, and Cecily was already at the door, and she kept her expression composed all the way down the steps and into the carriage and down the drive, with the great house receding behind them and the hills coming up ahead. Only when the gates of Ashbourne Park were out of sight did she press her hand against the bag in her lap and feel the small, hard shape of the cup beneath the fabric, and let herself believe, with a hope that terrified her absolutely, that Tuesday morning might be the beginning of something no one had thought to put on any list. Tuesday came with rain. Clara had spent 4 nights back in Colford telling herself every reasonable reason it was impossible. He was a duke. She was nobody. The gap between those two facts was not bridgeable by sentiment alone, regardless of what happened in libraries or on terraces when the hills went blue. She had been careful and thorough and entirely logical about it, lying in the dark. And then she had thought about the way he said her name on the terrace and understood that careful and thorough were not going to be enough. She was in the kitchen when the knock came. Her father's study door opened, voices exchanged in the hall, and then he appeared in the kitchen doorway with the expression of a man recalibrating everything he thought he knew about the morning. "Clara," he said, "there is a gentleman here to see me, and he says his name is Sebastian Vane." A pause. "He appears to have brought his sister, and a letter from the Bishop of Gloucester." Clara set down the preserving jar very carefully. Her mother had gone completely still beside the stove. She turned to look at Clara with the careful, padded solicitude she had been wearing for 4 days, the look reserved for people who have narrowly escaped doing something catastrophically foolish. It was, Clara noticed, beginning to slip. "I'll get my cloak," Clara said. Her father smiled, small and private, the smile of a man who's been right about his daughter for a very long time. "He asked if you might walk with him in the garden," he said. "I told him the rain was considerable." "It is," Clara said, "but I have a good cloak." Sebastian had been in many important studies, but he had never been as nervous as he was sitting in the study of a country vicar with a border collie examining his boots and Clara's father watching him from across a modest desk with the same quality of attention Clara brought to everything. The same clear eyes, the same unhurried, extracting gaze. "I want to be plain with you," the Reverend said. "My daughter has been told for many years that her qualities are the wrong kind, too direct, too decided, too unwilling to make herself smaller. She has borne that with more grace than I could have managed." He looked at Sebastian steadily. "I will not send her into a situation that confirms what those people told her. If you have come because she is interesting for a season, we have nothing further to discuss." "I came," Sebastian said, "because the last 4 days have been the longest of my recent life, and because she marked a passage in a Montaigne she wasn't planning to share with me, and I have not been able to stop thinking about it." The Reverend was quiet. Then, "Which passage?" Sebastian told him. Reverend Holt looked out the window at the rain for a long moment. Then he stood. "I believe my daughter's in the garden." Clara was at the far end of the path under the elm, which provided almost no protection from the rain, but was the furthest point from the house, and therefore the most private. She heard him come down the path before she turned. He was without a hat, his hair already damp, and he looked for the first time since she had seen him in proper clothes, like the man she had met in the garden. "My father received you," she said. "He did. He told me what he told you once when you were 12, about the curate who later married someone else. He said you never cried about it again in front of anyone." Sebastian looked at her steadily. "He said you have been carrying that story as proof of something it does not prove. And I want to tell you plainly, in case no one has said it clearly before, that there is nothing wrong with you. Nothing that needs correcting. You are not too much of anything. Anyone who told you otherwise was protecting their own comfort at the expense of your confidence, and they were wrong." Clara pressed her lips together. The elm dripped steadily onto her shoulder. "Your grandmother does not know you are here," she said. "She received a letter last Thursday explaining my intentions. She has not yet responded." He reached into his coat and produced the tin cup, battered now from days of travel in a coat pocket, the ink stain still faintly visible. He held it out. "I fell in love with you somewhere between this cup and the Montaigne and the morning you told me about the curate without a particle of self-pity. I love you, Clara, not as a conclusion I arrived at, as something that was already true before I understood it." The rain came down. From the house, very faintly, she heard her father's study window opening. Clara took the cup. Their fingers met on the metal, warm against the cold. "I will argue with you about Byron," she said, "and about the proper way to prune roses, and I will be right a significant portion of the time and will not pretend otherwise. I am counting on it. Society will watch us for years, waiting for evidence of what they expect. Let them watch. His fingers closed over hers. Two people who chose each other clearly, in full knowledge of everything, in a garden in the rain. She looked at the damp hair and the earnest eyes, and the man behind the title who had hidden from his own consequence in a borrowed shirt and been found by a woman with ink on her fingers. She thought about the very ordinary impulse that had sent her across a garden toward a stranger in the heat, how it had, quietly and without her permission, become the most significant walk of her life. "Yes," she said. He kissed her in the rain beneath the insufficient elm. It was imperfect and honest and entirely real, which was, Clara thought, rather the theme. They were married in October in the Colford church, on a Thursday, which was her father's quiet joke. The border collie sat outside and barked throughout the ceremony with the enthusiasm of a dog who knows something important is happening. Sebastian's grandmother came. This surprised everyone. She was expected to register her disapproval with the weapon of her absence, but she arrived in the family carriage and sat in the second pew and watched with the expression of a woman conducting an unannounced inspection. At the wedding breakfast, she approached Clara directly, and the room went quiet. "You argued with Lord Whitmore about agricultural theory," the dowager said. "His information was 30 years out of date," Clara said. It seemed a discourtesy to let him continue. The dowager held her gaze for a long moment. Then, with the smallest possible alteration of her expression, "He's been wrong about crop rotation since 1791. No one has told him." A pause. "You will do." It was the highest available praise, and it spread through the room like warmth, and it became the foundation of a family legend that would be repeated for years. The first winter at Ravensmoor was long and cold and full. Clara learned the estate methodically, rewrote the tenancy agreements, learned the name of every person on the staff and the names of their children. Sebastian watched it all and felt something settle into place that had been wrong for a very long time. One February evening, by the library fire, with the border collie on the hearthrug and snow on the gardens outside, he took her ink-stained hand and held it. "I was looking for someone who behaved honestly when no one was watching," he said. "And you simply came toward me with a cup of water because it was the obvious thing to do, and I was lost." Clara turned her hand in his. "And I was found," she said, "which I had rather stopped expecting." Outside, the snow covered the rose beds and the gravel paths in the kitchen garden wall. Inside, the fire burned, and Clara Holt, who had been told all her life she was not quite enough, sat in the chair that had been moved to accommodate her and held the hand of the man who still carried the memory of a tin cup, and found that belonging, when it finally came, felt exactly like the most ordinary thing in the world. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.